So if you guys would turn in your Bibles to Luke chapter 15, verse 25 to 33. I think it's going to be up on the screen here too, but we're going to go ahead and read through this. It's a short passage, but with the idea. The cost of being a disciple. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. If anyone who does not carry his cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Will he not first sit down and estimate the cost to see if he has enough money to complete it? Or if he lays the foundation and is not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.' Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Will he not first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. In the same way, any of you who does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple." The word of the Lord is powerful. The whole point of this, what we'll be talking about, is counting the cost of discipleship. And this is honestly, I was putting together this message, and I was thinking, Jeff always tells me that every passage we preach on a Sunday morning, we want to try to relate it to our church the best we can. And we're thinking, how badly does everyone need to hear this? And I was putting it together thinking, what can I say that's going to catch people's attention and be really profound? But I'm just not that. I'm just not that type of person. So I'm just gonna speak from the heart. This was a pretty heavy message for me to put together for a lot of reasons that I'll get into. It's very, very, very important. And which, by the way, all the men are on the mental tree. That's why Jeff's not here, because they mentioned that already. So they're all in the mountain chopping wood and playing with guns and doing who knows what else. Yeah, what men do. If any of you know Jared Hardum, Jared Hardum is involved. Guns and camping and fires are involved. That's just Jared. So, counting the cost of discipleship. So I'll talk about a little bit of background here in this passage first, so that we can kind of see first, why this passage is where it is, what it means. Because I went to school for biblical studies. I'm no scholar by any means, but just because I went to school there, I just have a habit of looking at the context, and the first century context, try to figure out what Jesus was trying to say to them, and then how that can translate to us. And so this passage is at a point in Jesus' ministry where he's preparing the disciples for his departure. Now, interestingly enough, last time I preached, we were talking about a point of Jesus' ministry where he was challenging the Jewish leadership. He was challenging the rituals, he was challenging their laws, he was challenging their festivals. But now we're at a time where it's getting closer to Jesus being crucified, and he knows this, and he's starting to prepare the disciples for what's going to happen, and for what they're going to have to, what's going to happen to them, what their life's going to be like once he's crucified. So the structure of the passage itself is, as you read it, I never understood why those stories were there. They just seemed like they were there, and they were like, oh, counting the cost, yeah, that's simple. But it's really cool that Luke puts this in a climactic sequence. So Jesus is using certain stories that would relate to the people then, and he's using these stories to try to add value to what being a disciple means. So the first story, the man that builds the building doesn't finish the building. He doesn't count the cost monetarily of what it's going to be to put that together, and he faces ridicule. Is the consequence. There's an action, there's a lack of counting the cost, there's a consequence. In the second story, there's also perceived action. If he was to act wrongly and not count the cost, instead of just being ridiculed, there's death, there's loss of kingdom, there's loss of lives. It's much more dire. And then as it continues to build, the whole point is, after those two stories, ridicule is bad, losing the kingdom is even worse, losing lives is even worse. And then after that, he says, in the same way, any of you who does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple. And the whole point of setting it up that way is pointing out to the people that he's talking to, the multitudes that he's talking to, that how much more calculated must we be in making a decision of being a disciple? He's telling those people how much more calculated you'd be so careful if you were going to build a building, and you make sure you had enough money before you started. If you were in battle, you would make sure that you had the resources and the people to win the battle before you went into battle. And then he's saying, but there's something even more important. He's saying becoming one of my disciples takes even more careful consideration and thought, and is much higher cost. And that's what he's trying to get at. Obviously, he's speaking to the multitudes in this, and that's important for a few different things we'll touch on. He's not just talking to the disciples. He's talking to there's lots of people that are following Jesus around, not just his 12 disciples. There's a few words in here that he uses for specific reasons. For example, hating. He talks about hating your father and mother, hating your family, renouncing all. There are first century contexts for these, and there are 21st century contexts for these, and how they're heard. When we hear hating, we just think of something totally different than they would have thought of. Hating was probably more Semitic hyperbole for loving less. There's a reason he says it that way. Later on in the passage, he talks about renouncing all. Obviously, in our context, it's not quite the same thing. Now, Jesus makes that demands of individuals sometimes, but it's a case-by-case basis, situation-by-situation basis. It depends on the person. The example that I kept coming back to is the rich man that Jesus has to give up everything. Now, obviously, not everybody's asked to give up everything they have to follow Christ, but in that case, there was a man who was totally distracted by his wealth and by his money, and so Jesus asked him to give that all up. But in this context, the reason Jesus uses such bold terminology and such striking verbiage is some literally had to choose between family or life, or family and Jesus or their life in Jesus. That's evident. I'm not going to make the turn there, but in Luke 12:49-53, it talks about, now there will be 5 in one family divided against each other, 3 against 2, 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, son against father, mother against daughter, daughter against mother. Because this was a time when following Jesus meant persecution, meant ostracism, it meant ridicule. There was a lot of connotations. So if you were to choose Jesus, Jesus literally had to be first choice in their lives. They could not choose anything. They had to love Jesus more than them. You have to love Jesus more than your family. You have to love Jesus more than your own life, because there might be a time where you have to test that out. There might be a time where, in the first century, where you're asked to choose between Jesus and your life, and if they love their life more than Jesus, then they would deny him. They would deny Jesus, and we saw that. I mean, Peter did that. When they asked 3 times. They asked Peter, "Weren't you one of them?" And he denied it. Some literally had to actually choose. Following Jesus meant so much more. Today, very few people actually are in a situation where they're asked to choose between Jesus and their life. It happens. There are people that have given their lives because someone asked them, "Do you believe in Jesus?" And they said yes. That was a very common thing in the first century. A lot of people had to give up their lives, had to give up their family, had to choose. So it was an all-in or all-out proposition. Now, how does this whole thing apply today? Understanding that different times, different sacrifices, different situation. There's a few things that I have to clarify. First off, when you read this passage, I had to be careful not to interpret this as work salvation. Salvation is by grace, period. There's no arguing that. Salvation is by grace, salvation is by faith, salvation is not by works. There's an interesting phrase that, I can't remember the passage, but that Paul uses, obedience that comes from the faith. In other words, commitment is revealed over the long term. Your commitment to Christ isn't going to be, a one-time thing where you raise your hand and say a short prayer to an evangelical appeal, and then just go on living your life like it was before. Jesus is concerned with our walk, and that true faith and that true commitment to being a follower of Christ is going to prove itself over the long term with the decisions that you make. So salvation is by grace, and this is always a tough subject to handle. Salvation is by grace, but your decisions and the things that you do, the way you live your life over the long term shows true faith. It shows whether or not you actually made a real commitment. So there are 3 points of application with this that I put together and want to talk about. I was thinking about this morning because I preached the 8 o'clock service. My mom came in and led the hymn, and we were talking about counting the cost, and she kind of like brought it up jokingly. Apparently something happened when I think I was like 4 or 5 or something like this. We lived in Montana, and I was just I wasn't a bad kid in the sense that like I got into a lot of trouble, but I was just snarky. Is that a word? Snarky, and like argumentative. It is now, yeah. Just argumentative and just hot-headed, and that was just me. But I remember one time, and in my mind, it was like I was like 5 years old. I wanted something, and in my mind, it was like my mom was like, "You're not getting food for the next month," and really, it was probably just like, "You don't get dessert, eat your dinner." I made it a lot worse than I was, but of course, as a little kid, I hear that, and I just like throw a fit. I'm just like, "What? I'm out," and I just kind of like left. And just started walking down the road. I ran away. When you're 6, you can't really run very far. So I ran away, and I got, again, in my mind, I got like 5 miles down the road, but it was probably like 100 yards, maybe. And I started, like, every step I took, I was like, dang, I didn't really think this through. Like, what am I doing? Like, I don't have any food. I don't have nothing. I don't know where I am. Like, I was lost. And we live in a town of, I grew up in a town of 30 people, so when you left our house, there wasn't another person for several miles. So I'm just like walking, I'm just like, what am I doing? Like, I didn't think about what my actions were going to do. I didn't count the cost of the decision I was going to make, so I just stormed off. And luckily, my mom's just like, fine, walk. I'm sure she walked down the road, she just watched me walk, and she's like, yeah, he'll decide. And then as soon as she starts seeing me turn around, she's like, all right, I'll go get him. So she gets in the car and goes and picks me up. And at that point, I was like, I have no idea why I did that. So that was something that she brought up this morning. We were talking about counting the cost, and she's like, yeah, you never counted the cost of any of the fits that you threw when you were 6. So how calculated must we be when choosing to follow Jesus? It's interesting how careful we are in every ordinary decision. Like I was thinking about, we bought a new car for the first time a few months ago. It was the first time we had bought a new one, and I was like so careful about everything. I know nothing about cars. Like if you ask me to work on it, I can change the oil, and that's about where I stop. And I learned everything about this car. I was like researching. I was so careful. We drove around in it. We made sure we got the mileage and all this stuff. Made sure the tires were good. And luckily, my dad was there. He knew more than me, so he was figuring stuff out. But just so careful, and we're so careful people are so careful when they pick out a house, when they pick out a TV. And just everything, they're just thinking, okay, I got to think about this, and I got to think about, when you're picking out a TV, you're thinking about how big it's going to be in relation to your room. Where's it going to sit? Are we going to be able to plug it in over here? And you make all these. You're so calculated and careful with all these decisions. And the most important consideration that you'll probably ever make in your life is your decision to follow Christ. And it's interesting how uncalculating people are when they make that decision, and how quick people are ready to say, yeah, I'm going to be a follower of Christ, and then they go and live their life just like normal. They don't count the cost of what it's actually going to take. Obviously, it's different today than it was in the first century, but it's still the most important decision that you're ever going to make, is becoming a disciple, becoming a follower of Christ. Now, what's challenging about this is we don't know what the future holds necessarily. We don't know, like I said before, most of us in here are probably not going to have a gun held to our head and say, are you a Christian? It's probably not going to happen. Most of us. It isn't as commonplace. You're probably not going to get crucified on a cross. Like, we don't know exactly you don't know what you're going to have to give up. You don't know what you're going to have to renounce. You don't know what you're going to have to push aside, pay less attention to. You don't know what your sacrifice and what your cost is going to be, because we don't know what the future holds. But there are a few things to consider. Consideration number 1 would be the cost of following versus the cost of not following. The cost of not following might be more normal in the eyes of society. The cost of not following Christ might be more culturally accepted decisions. It might just be more accepted in general. It might be easier. But the cost of not following, the cost of not following Christ in the long term is so much worse. The cost of following Christ now might be a little bit more difficult. Might be a little bit more difficult. You might have to make decisions that are a little bit against society's standards, a little bit different than most people would think. But in long term, the cost of following Christ and the reward to spend time with Him for eternity, what wouldn't you give up? Because when you don't understand what the future is going to hold, you don't count the cost as if you're looking at it and trying to figure out, okay, well, how much am I willing to give up? You just pay the price. You just make the decision, and then you manage the decision, and you pay the price regardless of what it might be. And that brings me to the second one, is no contingencies. Just being willing to pay the price. You know, when I was in middle school and in high school, I did a lot of athletics. I was a baseball player, and then I ran cross country in college. And when you decided to become part of a team, or you decided to compete in something at a high level, you don't put any contingencies on how you're going to get to your goal. So I looked at, for cross country, you know, I looked at a certain race, a certain time I wanted to get, a certain race I was going to win, and I was like, well, I'm going to do whatever it takes to get there. There weren't any contingencies. Because it's interesting, anytime you put a contingency on anything, whether or not it's a marriage, success, how much money you make, discipleship, whatever it is, if you put a contingency on something, the one thing you use as a contingency will be the one thing that stands in your way. And that's the same with discipleship. Because I decided that when I started to run, you know, I knew exactly what I was going to have to give up. I knew I was going to have to, you know, start eating healthier. I was going to start working out more than everybody else. I was going to have to, you know, get even unbelievably thinner than I am right now to run cross country real well. But I knew what I had to give up, and I had no contingencies. I'm like, I'm just going to do it. If I'd have been like, well, unless I have to do this, unless I have to do this. When you decide to be a disciple, if you put any contingencies on it and you're not willing to pay the price, whatever it might be, whatever that contingency is, Satan is going to use that to derail you. That's just what's going to happen. If you decide, well, I'll be a disciple unless except I don't want to give up this. I'll be a disciple unless God calls me overseas. I'll be a disciple unless this happens. That's not full submission. Because whatever contingency that is, the devil will figure out how to put that in your life and derail you from your walk. How calculating must be the most important consideration you must make. The second point I wanted to make was faith and discipleship. I hear this a lot. You know, I heard this a lot when I was going to school, just different people, and when I was in high school, I heard this a lot. And people growing up that just had a basic understanding, but the whole view was like faith and discipleship are different. It was like there's faith, there's accepting Christ and you're saved by grace, and then discipleship is like doing ministry or something like that. Like something that you could become faithful and you could be saved by grace, which you are, but then you could choose to be a disciple later. They're one and the same. Because when you decide to accept Christ into your life and you decide to become a follower of Him, you become a disciple. But discipleship doesn't necessarily mean you step into full-time ministry. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to be going and doing stuff at a church, although those things are very, very important. Discipleship is your daily walk with Christ, and Jesus is concerned with our walk. Again, salvation is by grace, but true faith proves itself over the long haul. All the decisions they make. We see people constantly where they accept Christ and they continue, they say they accept Christ and they continue to live their life just like they always have. Like, oh, I can do whatever I want. Jesus still loves me, and He does. And Jesus, I'm still saved by grace, and He does. But what kind of faith walk is that? If you decide to follow Christ and you don't change it, you continue to live the same exact way you lived before. And that brings me to my last point, making Jesus first priority. Again, renouncing all and hating all isn't the same today as it was back then. Different time, different sacrifice for people. Nowadays, you know, I've heard this before too. I've heard, you know, you must give up all, and it's even right here in the passage. It says, anyone who does not carry his cross will follow me, not a disciple. It says, in the same way, any of you who does not give up everything, not be my disciple. Now, Obviously today, there are a few people that believe that, you have to give up everything and be a true disciple. You can't have any money, you can't have anything, you just have to live on the edge of poverty to be a follower of Christ. Yes, Jesus requires that of some people. Some people will get distracted. But that's a different case-by-case situation for everybody. It's different for different people. People are distracted by different things. Jesus will ask you to give up whatever is getting in your life, being a true follower of Christ. So renouncing all and hating your family, hating your life doesn't mean the same thing, but if it were to come down to that, what would stand out? If you had to choose, today not everybody, I don't believe anybody has to give up everything they have to follow Christ, but what if Jesus did ask you? How many people would be willing to do that? In a time when the cost of choosing Jesus might mean losing your family and losing your life in the first century, then yes, that was a very literal statement. They had to literally give up everything. They had to be willing to give up everything to follow Jesus Christ. The challenging thing is it harder now, or was it harder in the first century to choose Jesus in terms of cultural effect? It's probably harder then. Nowadays, it's you can accept Christ, and you can probably go on and live your life pretty much the same way you did before, as far as cultural acceptance, as far as your friends, as far as your family. I think it was harder then to choose, because it was an in or out proposition. There wasn't any middle ground. It's either you were totally in, 100% a disciple of Christ, and nothing else mattered, or you denied Christ. Now, the issue is, it's too easy to accept Christ and become a disciple and be a lukewarm, half in, half out disciple. From a time when it might have been more difficult to choose, but there was no middle ground, almost as bad as choosing to be half in and half out. Now it's way too easy just to choose and not have to change a whole lot. It's too easy to do that, and that's where the challenge lies. Is how do you become a disciple today? Because we're in a culture where you can accept Christ, and yeah, you might face a little bit of ridicule. You might have to deny some relationships. I mean, who knows? Again, it's case-by-case basis. I don't know what you're going to have to give up. I know what I had to give up. You do have to be willing to renounce whatever gets in the way. But more probably, you're going to have to understand that God has a claim on all areas of your life. On all areas of your life. Everybody's in wherever they are for a specific reason. You're at a job you have for a specific reason. You're friends with the people you're friends with for a specific reason. Every situation you're in life, God's put you there for a reason. And God has a claim on all those areas of your life, wherever you are. God has a claim on it. How this works out in your life is going to take prayer, it's going to take study, it's going to take submission, it's going to take involvement in a healthy church. Because what being a disciple looks like today is you have to learn from God what He desires in each area of your life. Learn from God what He desires in each area of your life. At work, I work with, and there's no Christians at the bank branch that I work at. And not that there's no Christians in the company, there are, but at the branch that I work at, there's not. And it's really easy for me to think like, oh, I shouldn't be there. It's bad influence or whatever. Or I could be the good influence. And God has me there for a reason. So I looked at it like, okay, I'm in a workplace with a lot of crude humor, a lot of just bad lifestyle, people that aren't Christians, that some that don't understand, some that just are just angry at God for whatever reason, angry at church for whatever reason. And I looked at that and I decided, okay, I could get out of that, or I could be like, okay, I'm a disciple of Christ. God has a claim on this area of my life, so what does He desire from me in this area of my life? And so for me, it was a really cool thing where I got a chance to earn the respect because of the work that I did there. I earned their respect as an employee there, and then I'm able to just live my life in such a way that they notice there's something different about it. They notice that there's something a little bit different in the way that I carry myself, in the way that I talk, in the way that I act, in the way that I treat people. And I got a chance to be a disciple in an area where at first I didn't think I would have to. When I was in high school, I played baseball up until the end of high school, and I was good. I was in a position where as a freshman in high school, this isn't like kind of the fact there's a reason for it. I was a freshman in high school, and I was qualified. I started on the varsity team, and I was qualified for all conference freshman in high school. And so I was on my path to being a pro baseball player, because that's always what I wanted to do. But at some point, the lifestyle that I knew I would have to live started to, I started to hear whispers in my mind, and obviously I know it was Jesus speaking to me, but I started to slowly realize that there was a lifestyle, and there was a way that I was going to live as a baseball player that probably would have distracted me. And I don't know how it would have distracted me. I don't know necessarily what it was, but for some reason, a change was needed. I knew that if I continued to do that, I would go down a path that wasn't good, because I was praying, I was studying the Word, I was counseling with certain people in my life, and I just made a decision that, I'm done. Because I knew that there was something wrong with the path that I was going on, so I had to give up something. Very good. How am I glorifying God in every area of my life? Again, today being a disciple doesn't mean that you have to give up everything. Doesn't mean, in some cases it might, but it doesn't mean you have to change everything in your life as far as where you work, who you spend time with, because there's reasons that you're there. But God has a claim on all those areas, and you have to glorify God in every area of your life. That's how you be a disciple today. In whatever situation you're in, because everybody's situation is different, the decisions that you make, the choices that you make, the things that you talk about, the way you treat people, and how you live your life, glorifying and honoring God in everything you do, and giving everything you do and everything you have to glorify Him, that's how you be a disciple today. What the world accepts or is saying isn't always the best thing. You know, there was a bakery, I don't remember if it was a bakery or if it was a wedding cake shop, but there was a bakery in Littleton. You probably all know this story. They refused to make a cake for some people that were having a wedding that they didn't agree with marriage. And that store was just torn apart. Not physically, but they're out of business now. They don't exist. The world tore them to pieces. It would have been really, really easy for the owners of that bakery to be like, we're still Christians. God still, just making the cake. It's not a big deal. We'll make the cake. They'll go have their wedding. We have nothing to do with it. But they made a stand, and they decided, how are we going to glorify God in every area of our life? We're going to treat these people well. We're going to be kind to them. We're going to love them as Jesus loved them, but we're going to exercise our freedom of conscience, and we're not going to make a cake because we disagree. We believe that they're doing something that God doesn't agree with. And the decision that they made ruined their business. It ruined their life. They faced ridicule. They faced ostracism. They faced everything that the Christians in the first century would have faced. Today, it would have been much easier for them just to do what society deemed okay and make the cake and then just move on with their lives. But sometimes what the world accepts or is saying isn't what God is saying. Sometimes the earthly consequences seem like the worst thing in the world because they're right in front of you. Sometimes you have to make a decision with family. Sometimes you have to make a decision with relationships. We were in a position, this was probably 7 or 8 years ago, where there was a relationship in our family. Har and I had just got engaged. There was a relationship in our family that we didn't agree with. We didn't agree with the relationship, and everybody else in our family agreed. And we just felt like there was a lot of prayer around it. There's a lot of, we talked about it a lot. We counseled people a lot. And we felt like, okay, there's 2 ways we can go about this. We can either keep our mouths shut, not upset anybody, let them get married, just let it ride. We don't have to get in anybody's way. But we said something, and it hurt a lot of relationships. Not anymore. We've rebuilt those relationships by the grace of God. But for a while, those relationships were strained. Those relationships were broken because we decided that there was a decision that we had to make. We had to say something. We had to make a stand. for something that we believed in at the expense of some relationships. We are loving about it, we are Christ-like about it, but sometimes you have to make the decision. One of the things that is the most difficult in this is we, there some people are actually a lot of people. Let's just be honest. A lot of people are getting divorced. Marriages are falling apart all over the place because there's a lot of logical, worldly reasons. I mean, you can any struggling relationship. There's a lot of logical and worldly and just it would make sense to get divorced. You can look at it in all these different ways and be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, this totally makes sense. Oh, they don't get along anymore. There's all these different reasons. But it's too easy. And this is very, we have family members that have gone through and are going through this right now, where the world is telling them and everything else around them is telling them that ending the marriage would be the best thing for them to do, because it would logically make sense by the world standards. But what is God telling them? And that's the most challenging thing. Each and every one of us is going to face a moment or more or a lot, whether or not they're simple choices, whether or not they're life-changing choices, whether or not it affects our life. Everyone's going to face a choice where they're going to have to prove whether or not they're a disciple. You're going to face decisions in your life. You're going to face choices that you're going to have to make. And there's going to be two voices. There's going to be, the one that makes the most sense, seemingly, is the world is going to try to influence you one way. But then as a disciple in Christ, are you going to decide to glorify God in every area of your life? Are you going to make decisions? Are you going to prove that you're a disciple of Christ? Prove your commitment over the long term and make decisions that reflect Him and reflect honoring Him and glorifying Him and praising Him every day of your life. As a worship pastor, it's really easy to get caught up in worship is the music, worship is a certain style of music, or worship is this, or worship is everything, or whatever. But true worship is glorifying God in every area of your life and the decisions that you make. And every day when you wake up and you live your life on purpose and you make a decision that's going to glorify Him, and that's going to take whatever you're doing, whoever you are, whatever decision you're making, and is going to make everybody else around you realize that God's involved, that's true worship. Every single day. And so when you make a decision every day, when you make that decision, does your decision just fall into the societal standards? Does it make sense to everybody else? Like, oh yeah, or do you make a decision and people don't understand, but they know that it's because you're a disciple of Christ? How often do you get a chance to do that? Every day of your life. Glorifying God in every area, because there's an almighty God that has control of every area, that has claim on every area of your life. You made the decision. You decided to follow Christ. You decided to give everything you have to Him and give every decision to Him. Submit to Christ and live your life for Him. You've already made the decision. So now every day of your life you just have to purposefully manage that decision and point everyone around you by your life to Jesus Christ. May you bow your head. Heavenly Father, we are surrounded by a world of everything. Everything but discipleship. And we're not here to try to gain our salvation by works. We're not here to try to prove something to Jesus. We're not here to try to prove anything to anybody. We're just here to take each individual life. I'm going to take my life. Everyone will take their lives. And we're going to take the life that you've blessed us with, and everything you've given us. And we're going to make every decision and live every day purposefully to show everyone around us that you're the primary influence of God. We have an opportunity to change lives because we have a God who's great. We serve a God who's powerful. And we worship you every day by being in submission to you and making decisions that reflect you and your glory. As a corporate church, we are here to stand ready to fight, ready to stand in battle, ready to worship you and to praise you with everything that we have. Glorify your name. We could ask for nothing more amazing to do with our lives than to worship you with everything that we have.